There are few things that St. Mary Mead treasures more than a proper summer fete, particularly one with a worthy cause. The cause in question, announced on neat little placards positioned beside the homemade preserves and embroidered tea cozies, was the restoration of the ancient clock in St. Petrock's bell tower, which had been keeping increasingly erratic time and had recently taken to chiming whenever the fancy struck it, rather like an elderly relative who continues chattering long after the conversation has moved on. Sir Barnaby Cresswell of Fallowfield Manor, being a gentleman who believed firmly that both timepieces and people should fulfill their proper functions, had graciously offered his grounds for the occasion. He stood now near the entrance to his rose garden, resplendent in well-tailored tweeds that had cost considerable sums to achieve their comfortable, lived-in appearance, greeting his guests with the hearty bonhomie of a man who genuinely enjoyed playing the benevolent squire. Miss Jane Marple had positioned herself strategically beneath the spreading branches of an ancient lime tree, her knitting needles clicking with gentle precision as she worked on what appeared to be a christening shawl. Her pale blue eyes, however, were far from focused solely on her handiwork. Instead, they moved with the practiced observation of someone who had spent decades studying the endlessly fascinating complexities of human nature as it played out in the microcosm of village life. The afternoon had provided her with considerable material for observation. There was Mrs. Phyllis Brewster from the post office, who served as the village's unofficial information exchange, currently engaged in animated conversation with the new vicar's wife about the goings-on at Rosemary Cottage. There was young Dr. Michael Hartwell, who had recently taken over old Dr. Pemberton's practice, looking rather overwhelmed by the social expectations of his position as he attempted to make appropriate conversation with the Ladies' Guild. Most intriguingly, there was the subtle but unmistakable tension surrounding the guest of honor, Mr. Reginald Fortescue, the wealthy industrialist who had funded the clock's restoration. Mr. Fortescue was a man in his early 60s with the sort of commanding presence that came from decades of having his opinions treated as gospel. He had made his fortune in manufacturing during the war and had recently retired to the countryside, purchasing the old Blackwood estate and immediately setting about improving it in ways that had not endeared him to his new neighbors. His generous donation toward the clock restoration was widely viewed as an attempt to purchase acceptance into village society, an endeavor that was meeting with mixed success. "Such a lovely turnout," remarked Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling herself into the wicker chair beside Miss Marple with a satisfied sigh. "Though I must say the atmosphere seems rather charged today. Have you noticed how carefully everyone's avoiding direct conversation with our benefactor?" Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment. "People do find it difficult to accept generosity from those they don't quite trust," she observed mildly. "Though I suspect Mr. Fortescue's troubles with the village run deeper than mere unfamiliarity." Indeed, the whispers had been circulating for weeks. There were rumors about Mr. Fortescue's business practices during the war, suggestions that his patriotic contracts had involved rather less patriotism and rather more profiteering than was seemly. More recently, there had been talk about his treatment of the tenant farmers whose land he had absorbed into his estate, and his high-handed dismissal of several long-time servants at Blackwood House. The centerpiece of the afternoon's festivities was the clock itself, a magnificent long-case timepiece that had been carefully transported from the bell tower for restoration by Mr. Leonard Thorne, a specialist from London. Mr. Thorne, a smooth gentleman with an equally smooth manner of speaking, had spent the better part of an hour explaining the intricacies of the mechanism to anyone who would listen, though Miss Marple had noticed that his technical expertise seemed to vary depending on his audience's level of knowledge. "The beauty of these old mechanisms," Mr. Thorne was explaining to a small group that included the vicar and several members of the parish council, "lies in their simplicity. Weight, release, and timing, rather like human nature, wouldn't you say? All the trouble comes when something fails to regulate itself properly." Miss Marple found this observation rather apt, though perhaps not in the way Mr. Thorne intended. As the afternoon progressed toward the appointed hour for the clock's ceremonial restart, the tensions that had been simmering beneath the surface of polite conversation began to manifest more obviously. She observed young James Whitmore, son of the local bank manager, engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated discussion with Mr. Fortescue near the refreshment tent. The conversation was too distant for her to overhear, but the young man's posture suggested considerable agitation, while Mr. Fortescue's responses seemed dismissive, almost contemptuous. Similarly, she noticed Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the doctor's wife, watching Mr. Fortescue with an expression that could only be described as deeply troubled. When their eyes met across the lawn, Mrs. Hartwell quickly looked away, but not before Miss Marple caught a glimpse of what looked remarkably like fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sir Barnaby's voice boomed across the gathering as the church clock struck the quarter hour before 4. "If I might have your attention, we're about to witness the resurrection of our faithful timekeeper." The crowd gathered around the makeshift platform where the restored clock stood in polished splendor. Mr. Thorne made a few final adjustments with obvious pride, while Mr. Fortescue positioned himself prominently at the front of the group, clearly expecting to play a central role in the proceedings. "At precisely 4 o'clock, Mr. Thorne announced, "this magnificent mechanism will resume its duty of keeping time for our community. I've made a small modification to mark this special occasion, a little surprise that I think you'll find quite charming." Miss Marple's knitting needles slowed slightly. In her considerable experience, surprises involving machinery and self-important men often proved to be less charming than advertised. The moments leading up to 4 o'clock passed with the peculiar tension that accompanies any public ceremony where something might go wrong. Conversations died away to expectant murmurs. Pocket watches were consulted. Children were hushed and positioned where they could see properly. 4 o'clock arrived with the precision of English punctuality. Mr. Thorne made a final adjustment, and the clock began its measured chiming. 1, 2, 3, 4. But instead of stopping, as any reasonable timepiece should, the mechanism continued its sonorous announcements. 5, 6, 7. Puzzled glances were exchanged. Mr. Thorne's confident smile began to waver slightly. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And then, with the serene assurance of a mechanism following its programming without question or conscience, the clock delivered a 13th stroke. The sound seemed to hang in the afternoon air longer than was natural, and in that extended moment, Miss Marple noticed several things that would prove significant. She observed Mr. Fortescue's face flush with what appeared to be more than mere embarrassment at the mechanical malfunction. She noted Mrs. Hartwell's sharp intake of breath and the way her hand moved instinctively to her throat. Most particularly, she noticed that during the confusion and nervous laughter that followed the unexpected 13th chime, several people had moved from their previous positions, movements that might have gone unnoticed in the general shuffling, but which struck her observant eye as purposeful rather than random. It was perhaps 30 seconds after the final, impossible chime had faded that the scream pierced the afternoon air. The cry came from the direction of the manor house, sharp and unmistakably female. The crowd turned as one toward the sound, that peculiar English instinct for both curiosity and propriety creating a moment of hesitation before people began moving toward the source of the disturbance. Miss Marple, who had learned long ago that running was both undignified and often counterproductive, gathered her knitting with deliberate care and followed at her own measured pace. By the time she reached the terrace behind the house, a crowd had already gathered around the ornamental pond, their voices creating that particular murmur of shock and disbelief that accompanies the discovery of tragedy. Mr. Reginald Fortescue lay floating face down in the shallow water among the lily pads, his expensive suit darkened with moisture, his carefully styled hair now plastered against his skull. The walking stick he had been carrying, an elaborate affair with a silver head, lay on the stone coping of the pond, as though it had been carefully placed there rather than dropped. Dr. Hartwell was already kneeling by the pond's edge, having waded in to examine the body with professional thoroughness. When he looked up, his young face was grave with the weight of unwelcome knowledge. "He's dead," he announced quietly. "I'm afraid there's nothing to be done." The murmur of the crowd shifted to accommodate this confirmation of what most had already suspected. Miss Marple positioned herself where she could observe both the scene and the reactions of those present, her trained eye taking in details that others might miss in their shock. She noticed the absence of any signs of struggle around the pond's edge. She observed that Mr. Fortescue's expensive pocket watch had stopped at precisely 13 minutes past 4, an odd coincidence, given the clock's recent performance. Most significantly, she noted the way certain members of the gathering avoided looking directly at the body, while others seemed almost relieved beneath their expressions of appropriate shock. "We must telephone the police immediately," Sir Barnaby declared, though his voice lacked its usual commanding tone. This is most irregular." As the crowd began to disperse under Sir Barnaby's direction, Miss Marple remained by the pond, ostensibly to offer comfort to Mrs. Hartwell, who had gone quite pale at the sight. In reality, she was studying the scene with the methodical attention she had learned to apply to such situations. The clock that had struck 13 had announced more than a mechanical malfunction, she suspected. It had marked the beginning of something far more complex and dangerous than a simple accident. In her long experience of human nature, she had learned that when people gathered to celebrate restoration and renewal, they sometimes found instead that the past had ways of demanding its own accounting. The afternoon sun continued to shine with deceptive cheerfulness on the garden fete, but Miss Marple knew that the shadow that had fallen over St. Mary Mead would not be so easily dispelled. Somewhere among the proper ladies and gentlemen who were now discussing the tragedy in hushed, shocked tones was someone who had used the confusion of the 13th chime to commit murder. The question that remained was not whether Mr. Fortescue had been killed deliberately. Miss Marple's instincts told her that much was certain. The question was which of his many enemies had finally decided that the time had come for a very different sort of restoration indeed. As the police constable arrived from Much Benham and began the process of securing the scene, Miss Marple quietly retrieved her knitting and settled herself to observe. The real mystery, she knew, was only just beginning. The shock of Mr. Fortescue's death rippled outward from Sir Barnaby's ornamental pond like the disturbed water itself, carrying with it a peculiar mixture of horror, excitement, and that distinctly English tendency to find order through the proper observance of social protocols. Within minutes, the cheerful chaos of a village fete had transformed into something far more complex. A gathering where every conversation carried undertones of suspicion and every glance might conceal knowledge of murder. The arrival of authority. Constable Davies from Much Benham arrived first, his bicycle propped somewhat uncertainly against Sir Barnaby's rose trellis as he surveyed a scene that was clearly beyond his usual purview of lost sheep and minor pilfering. His earnest attempts to secure the area were hampered by the natural reluctance of proper English ladies and gentlemen to be ordered about by someone they had known since he was in short trousers. Fortunately, Inspector Slack's motor car appeared within the hour, bringing with it the sort of official presence that even Sir Barnaby felt obliged to acknowledge. Inspector Slack, a lean man with sharp features and an even sharper manner, had encountered Miss Marple's particular talents before and was no longer capable of dismissing her observations without considerable effort. He examined the scene with the methodical attention of someone who understood that village murders were often far more complex than they initially appeared. "Drowning in 2 feet of ornamental water," he muttered, crouching beside the pond. "Either the man had a seizure, or someone wanted us to think he did." His gaze moved to the precisely placed walking stick, the undisturbed gravel around the pond's edge, and the curious fact that Mr. Fortescue's expensive pocket watch had stopped at exactly 13 minutes past 4. The village theories take shape. As the afternoon progressed toward evening, the various theories about Mr. Fortescue's demise began to crystallize around the natural gathering places of village life. Mrs. Phyllis Brewster, having appointed herself the unofficial coordinator of information, held court in her sitting room above the post office, where a steady stream of visitors came to share what they knew and learn what others had discovered. "Mark my words," declared Colonel Melchett, who had driven over from Much Benham upon hearing the news. "It's a clear case of accidental drowning. The excitement of the clock malfunction, perhaps a weak heart. These things happen to men of his age." But Mrs. Brewster possessed information that cast doubt on such innocent explanations. "He received a most unpleasant telephone call this morning," she announced with the satisfaction of someone who had been strategically positioned near the post office telephone exchange. "Quite agitated afterward, he was. Someone making demands, if you ask me. Financial demands." This revelation sparked considerable interest, particularly from those who had suspected that Mr. Fortescue's business affairs were not entirely above board. Young Dr. Hartwell, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, looking rather overwhelmed by his first encounter with violent death, shifted uncomfortably at the mention of financial irregularities. Character, revelations, and suspicious behaviors. The absence of James Whitmore from the evening's gathering was noted by several observers, particularly given his heated exchange with Mr. Fortescue just before the tragedy. Mrs. Brewster was quick to point out that the young man had been conspicuously avoiding company since the discovery of the body. "Something about debts and family honor," she reported with obvious relish. "Raised voices, pointing fingers. Most unseemly behavior for a garden fete. And now he's nowhere to be found." Mr. Leonard Thorne, the clock specialist, appeared increasingly nervous as the evening progressed, frequently checking his pocket watch and starting at unexpected sounds. His explanations about the 13th chime grew more elaborate with each telling, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as his audience that the mechanical malfunction was entirely innocent. "A simple matter of overwinding," he insisted for the 4th time. "These old mechanisms can be unpredictable when subjected to modern restoration techniques. The timing was purely coincidental." Miss Marple's quiet observations. Throughout these discussions, Miss Marple maintained her position as an interested but unobtrusive observer, her knitting needles clicking steadily as she absorbed the various currents of information and emotion flowing around her. She noted how certain individuals reacted to specific topics. Mrs. Hartwell's visible distress whenever the clock was mentioned, James Whitmore's conspicuous absence, Mr. Thorne's increasingly frantic explanations. More significantly, she observed the physical evidence that others overlooked. The walking stick's silver head was completely dry, despite its owner's death by drowning. The lily pads disturbed in the center of the pond, rather than near the edge where someone might naturally fall. The curious precision with which Mr. Fortescue's watch had stopped at 13 minutes past 4, exactly 13 minutes after the clock's impossible 13th chime. When Sir Barnaby mentioned that the little side gate to the orchard had been recently planned to open smoothly, Miss Marple filed this information away with particular interest. She had noticed a dark smudge on the gate's latch earlier. Not mud, for the day had been dry, but something else entirely. The web of motives emerges. As the evening's discussions continued, a complex picture of Mr. Fortescue's relationships began to emerge. His business practices during the war had apparently involved considerable profiteering at the expense of patriotic duty. His treatment of tenant farmers had been harsh to the point of cruelty. His recent financial dealings had left several local families in difficult circumstances, including, it seemed, the Whitmores at the bank. Mrs. Cooper, the solicitor's wife, contributed her own observations about the deceased's character. "He treated people like figures on a ledger," she said with quiet disapproval. "No consideration for their circumstances or feelings. Those poor tenants at Blackwood House, he raised their rents something shocking, then evicted them when they couldn't pay." Dr. Hartwell's wife, Eleanor, had remained notably quiet throughout most discussions, but Miss Marple observed that she started visibly whenever anyone mentioned the clock or its ominous 13th chime. When their eyes met, Mrs. Hartwell quickly looked away, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Inspector Slack's preliminary conclusions. By evening, Inspector Slack had completed his initial examination of the scene and interviewed the principal witnesses. His conclusions, shared reluctantly with Sir Barnaby and overheard by those with particularly acute hearing, suggested that the police were treating Mr. Fortescue's death as suspicious. Too many irregularities, he confided to Sir Barnaby as they stood in the library. The positioning of the body, the placement of personal effects, the timing of events. Either we're dealing with a remarkably convenient series of coincidences, or someone used that clock's malfunction as cover for murder. The inspector's words, quickly spreading through the village's efficient communication network, transformed the atmosphere from speculation to genuine unease. The possibility that they had all been present at the scene of a deliberate murder, and that the murderer was likely among them, cast a distinctly uncomfortable shadow over the community. The evening's unsettling conclusion. As the various gatherings finally began to disperse, Miss Marple reflected on the threads of information she had collected throughout the day. Mr. Fortescue had clearly been a man who inspired strong emotions, anger, resentment, fear, and perhaps desperate hatred. The challenge would be determining which of his many enemies had finally decided that the time had come for a very different sort of restoration. The clock that had struck 13 had done more than announce a mechanical malfunction. It had marked a moment when someone's carefully laid plans had come to fruition, using the confusion and misdirection of an impossible chime to commit what might well prove to be the perfect murder. In her neat cottage, Miss Marple wound her own reliable timepiece and set it, as always, by the vicarage chimes. But as she prepared for sleep, her mind remained active, sorting through the day's observations with the methodical patience that had served her so well in previous encounters with human wickedness. The 13th chime had been more than an accident of mechanics. It had been a signal, a cover, and perhaps most significantly, a clue to the identity of someone who understood that timing, in murder as in clockwork, was absolutely everything. Tomorrow would bring fresh revelations and deeper investigations, but Miss Marple already suspected that the solution to Mr. Fortescue's death lay not in the obvious motives and dramatic confrontations that had captured everyone's attention, but in the small, seemingly insignificant details that only careful observation could reveal. The murderer had been clever, but in her considerable experience, cleverness often carried within it the seeds of its own undoing. The morning after Mr. Fortescue's shocking death brought with it that peculiar quality of light that follows dramatic events, as though the very air had been clarified by tragedy. St. Mary Mead stirred to life with the careful precision of a community that understood something fundamental had shifted in their ordered world. Milk bottles appeared on doorsteps with their usual punctuality, but the conversations that accompanied their collection carried undertones of speculation and unease that transformed routine encounters into exchanges of vital intelligence. Inspector Slack had established his headquarters in Sir Barnaby's library with the methodical efficiency that characterized all his professional endeavors. The comfortable, book-lined sanctuary had been transformed into something resembling an official inquiry, with evidence bags arranged on the baize-topped table and witness statements accumulating in neat piles that suggested order could be restored through proper procedure. His questions were brisk and purposeful, delivered with the sort of authority that expected immediate and complete responses. James Whitmore stood before the inspector's makeshift desk with his cap clutched in nervous hands, his youthful face bearing the unmistakable signs of a sleepless night. The boy, for despite his 22 years, anxiety had stripped away any pretense of adult composure, had clearly made hasty preparations for this interview, evidenced by a patch beneath his chin that had escaped his razor's attention. His eyes carried that particular combination of defiance and shame that Inspector Slack had learned to recognize as the hallmark of someone harboring guilty knowledge. "You argued with Mr. Fortescue yesterday afternoon," Slack stated without preamble, his pencil poised above his notepad. Multiple witnesses observed the confrontation near the refreshment tent. "What was the nature of your disagreement?" James's response came, in fits and starts, his voice cracking with a strain of confession. The story that emerged was one of financial desperation and moral compromise. Mr. Fortescue had discovered James's unauthorized speculation with bank funds and was using this knowledge to coerce cooperation in what amounted to commercial espionage. When James refused to provide confidential information about other clients' affairs, Fortescue had threatened to expose the embezzlement and destroy both father and son. "I told him I wouldn't be his clerk," James finished, his voice barely above a whisper. "He laughed and said I'd changed my mind when father lost his position and we both ended up in prison." The motive was clear and compelling, painted in the stark colors of desperation that had driven many young men to acts they would never have contemplated under ordinary circumstances. Inspector Slack made careful notes, already constructing the case that would satisfy his superiors and restore order to the disrupted community. Miss Marple, who had been permitted a chair by the library window owing to her reputation for discretion and her seemingly harmless needlework, kept her pale blue eyes fixed upon her knitting while her sharp ears absorbed every nuance of the conversation. She observed the way James's anger, which was genuine enough, gave way to shame, a more revealing emotion that suggested the boy's troubles ran deeper than simple financial difficulty. In her considerable experience with human nature, she had learned that shame whispered secrets that anger would never reveal. When asked about his whereabouts at the crucial time, James provided what appeared to be a solid alibi. "I walked down to the railway crossing after our discussion. I needed air, needed to think. Old Hargreaves at the gate saw me there just after 4 o'clock. He'll confirm it." Inspector Slack made a note to verify this claim, though his expression suggested he expected the alibi to prove less solid under examination. In his experience, guilty parties often provided alibis that seemed convincing until subjected to careful scrutiny. The clock specialist, Mr. Leonard Thorne, presented a markedly different demeanor when summoned for his interview. Where James had appeared nervous and defensive, Thorne maintained the composed professionalism of someone accustomed to explaining technical matters to laymen. His gloves were immaculate, his bearing confident, though Miss Marple detected subtle signs of strain in the precise way he selected his words, as though each phrase required careful consideration before delivery. "An unfortunate mechanical embellishment," Thorne explained when questioned about the 13th chime, a celebratory flourish that was intended to mark the restoration's completion. The timing mechanism malfunctioned, causing the extra stroke to occur at 4 o'clock rather than at the predetermined moment during the ceremony. Inspector Slack's eyebrows rose slightly. "Yesterday you mentioned overwinding as the cause. Today you speak of predetermined timing mechanisms. Which explanation should I record as accurate?" Thorne's composure flickered momentarily, his hands adjusting his gloves with unnecessary precision. "Perhaps I oversimplified for the lay audience yesterday. The technical details are quite complex, involving release springs and escapement mechanisms that wouldn't be familiar to most observers." Miss Marple continued her knitting with steady concentration, but her trained mind catalogued the inconsistencies in Thorne's explanations. In her experience, honest men told the same story repeatedly, while those with something to hide often embellished their accounts with additional technical details that served more to confuse than clarify. The village's unofficial information network, centered around Mrs. Brewster's post office, had been working with remarkable efficiency since dawn. By mid-morning, a complex picture of Mr. Fortescue's final day had emerged from the collective observations of shopkeepers, servants, and casual passers-by. Mrs. Brewster herself contributed the most significant intelligence. She had overheard a telephone conversation from the post office kiosk in which Fortescue had demanded that someone be found at once, if you value your position. The conversation had been heated enough to carry through the thin walls of her establishment, and Fortescue had emerged from the kiosk in a state of obvious agitation. Additional details accumulated throughout the morning like pieces of a complex puzzle. The vicar's wife remembered lending the church keys to Mrs. Hartwell the previous week for Ladies' Guild activities that had been extended due to influenza in the parish. Sir Barnaby's gardener reported finding the orchard gate standing open when it was customarily kept latched for safety reasons. The manor's housekeeper mentioned several visitors who had claimed to be seeking the powder room but had somehow found themselves in other parts of the house entirely. Miss Marple absorbed these details with the methodical attention she applied to particularly complex knitting patterns. During her afternoon constitutional, she made a point of examining the orchard gate that had attracted such interest. The latch bore a faint residue that left a metallic sheen on her gloved finger, not ordinary garden dirt, but something with the distinctive properties of specialized lubricants used in delicate mechanical work. Her visit to the Hartwell cottage, ostensibly to deliver a completed christening gown, revealed additional details that might have escaped less observant eyes. Eleanor Hartwell appeared unusually strained, her typically immaculate sitting room showing subtle signs of distracted maintenance. Most significantly, a brass key with an ornate oval bow lay prominently displayed on the writing desk, its surface polished to an almost suspicious brightness, but bearing scratches around the edges that suggested frequent or inexpert use. Dr. Hartwell himself seemed genuinely troubled by the tragedy, his medical training having taught him to look beyond obvious symptoms to underlying causes. "I cannot bring myself to believe young James capable of cold-blooded murder," he confided to his wife during Miss Marple's visit. "Hot-tempered, perhaps, but hardly the sort to plan and execute such a calculated crime." Eleanor's reaction to this observation was immediate and telling. A sharp look, followed by increased agitation, as though the possibility of James's innocence was more disturbing than the certainty of his guilt. "Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one, Michael," she said with unusual firmness. "The evidence seems quite clear." As the day progressed toward its inevitable conclusion, Inspector Slack's investigation had accumulated sufficient evidence to satisfy his superiors in the community's desire for swift justice. James Whitmore's motive was compelling, his opportunity apparent, and his nervous behavior entirely consistent with guilt. The case appeared to be resolving itself with a sort of administrative efficiency that proper English justice demanded. However, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that others seemed eager to dismiss as irrelevant. The walking stick's precise positioning on the pond's coping, completely dry despite its owner's death by drowning. The pocket watch stopped at exactly 13 minutes past 4, a coincidence that seemed too convenient given the clock's recent performance. Most significantly, the 13th chime itself, which had created exactly the sort of confusion and misdirection that a clever murderer might exploit to commit the perfect crime. The physical evidence told a story of careful planning rather than passionate impulse. Someone had understood not only the mechanics of murder but also the psychology of investigation, creating a scenario where suspicion would fall naturally on the most obvious candidate, while the real perpetrator remained safely hidden among the shocked and grieving community. As evening shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of relationships and rivalries that had been revealed by the day's investigations. Mr. Fortescue had clearly been a man who inspired strong emotions, anger, resentment, and perhaps something far more dangerous than either. The challenge would be distinguishing between understandable grievances and murderous intent, between justified anger and inexcusable action. The clock in St. Petrock's Tower chimed the hour with its customary restraint, having been restored to proper function after its dramatic malfunction. But Miss Marple understood that the 13th chime had been more than a mechanical error. It had been both signal and smokescreen, marking not just the moment of murder but the culmination of a carefully orchestrated deception that had fooled everyone except perhaps one elderly lady with sharp eyes and an even sharper understanding of human nature. Tomorrow would bring James Whitmore's formal arrest and the community's collective sigh of relief that their ordeal was over. But Miss Marple suspected that the real investigation was only beginning, and that somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the true murderer was watching with satisfaction as their elaborate plan unfolded exactly as intended. The 13th chime had struck, but its echoes would continue to reverberate until the complete truth was finally revealed. Morning brought a deceptive calm to St. Mary Mead, the kind of stillness that follows violent storms and leaves everything appearing normal while the very air seems to hum with residual tension. Sunlight filtered through lace curtains as it always did. Milk bottles stood sentinel on doorsteps, and the vicar's bell chimed the half-hour with its customary precision. Yet beneath these familiar rhythms, something had fundamentally shifted. Conversations were briefer, glances more measuring, and even the sparrows on the village green seemed to hop with an anxious briskness that suggested they, too, sensed that all was not well in their small world. Inspector Slack's methodical approach. Inspector Slack had begun his work early, establishing his temporary headquarters in Sir Barnaby's library and transforming the comfortable, book-lined sanctuary into something resembling an official inquiry. His methodical nature served him well in such circumstances, and by mid-morning he had already conducted preliminary interviews with the manor's staff and several key witnesses from the previous day's festivities. Mrs. Armitage, Sir Barnaby's housekeeper, provided the sort of detailed account one might expect from a woman who had presided over the household for the better part of a decade. There had been the usual complications of a large gathering: insufficient teaspoons, surplus jam fingerprints, and the inevitable stream of visitors who claimed to be seeking the powder room but somehow found themselves in the library or wandering through the orchard. Most significantly, she reported that the side gate to the orchard, which was habitually kept latched for safety reasons, had been found standing open. This detail captured Inspector Slack's immediate attention. He examined the gate personally, calling Constable Davies over to observe a dark smudge on the latch that Miss Marple had noticed the previous day. The stain, still faintly visible despite the morning's drying effects, left a smooth, metallic sheen when touched with a handkerchief. "Not earth," Slack muttered, filing the observation away for further investigation. The case against James Whitmore. By 10 o'clock, James Whitmore had been located and brought in for questioning. The young man appeared haggard, having spent a sleepless night in his rented room above his father's garage, and his demeanor alternated between defiance and barely concealed despair. The financial pressures that had driven him to his confrontation with Mr. Fortescue emerged during the interview with painful clarity. "You argued with Mr. Fortescue," Inspector Slack stated without preamble, his tone carrying the weight of established fact rather than mere inquiry. James's voice cracked slightly as he responded, betraying his youth despite his attempts at composure. "Everyone argued with Mr. Fortescue. He threatened my father, said he'd call in the overdraft if I didn't agree to work for him, bring him information from the bank." The young man's face flushed with remembered humiliation. There had been a speculation on the exchange that went wrong. He knew about it somehow. I told him I'd rather see him. He caught himself, glancing around the room with sudden awareness of his audience. I told him no. The motive was clear and compelling. Mr. Fortescue had apparently discovered James's unauthorized use of bank funds for speculation and was using this knowledge to coerce the young man into providing confidential information about other clients' affairs. When James refused, Fortescue had threatened to expose the embezzlement and ruin both father and son. "And where were you at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon?" Slack pressed. "At the railway crossing," James replied, seizing upon his prepared alibi. "The gatekeeper saw me. I needed air after our discussion." It was not precisely a lie, but it lacked the firmness of complete truth, and Inspector Slack's experienced ear detected the subtle evasion. Community reaction and gossip. Word of James Whitmore's status as prime suspect spread through St. Mary Mead with the efficiency of a well-oiled telegraph system. Mrs. Brewster, positioned strategically at her post office window, served as the primary distribution point for information, while various neighbors and acquaintances carried the news to every corner of the village. "Always said that boy had too much temper for his own good," declared Colonel Melchett, who had appointed himself an unofficial advisor to the investigation. "Young men today have no sense of proper behavior when faced with difficulties. In my day, a gentleman would have found an honorable solution." The identification of an apparent culprit brought visible relief to many villagers, who preferred the comfort of a solved mystery to the unsettling possibility that a murderer remained among them. The bank manager's wife took to her bed with a headache, while her husband closeted himself in his office, presumably grappling with the implications of his son's alleged crime. Physical evidence and technical details. Meanwhile, Mr. Leonard Thorne presented himself to Inspector Slack with an eagerness that seemed calculated to demonstrate cooperation. His explanations about the clock's 13th chime had grown increasingly elaborate overnight, as though repetition might somehow make the mechanical malfunction seem more plausible. "It was merely a harmless flourish," he insisted, his eyes perhaps a bit too bright with nervous energy. "A 13th chime to mark the restoration, programmed to occur only at 4 o'clock as a demonstration, completely harmless." Inspector Slack observed the clock specialist with growing interest, noting the faint metallic scent that clung to Thorne's gloves and the slight darkening on his cuffs where something oily had rubbed against the fabric. The modification required to produce the 13th chime was far more sophisticated than simple overwinding, requiring precise knowledge of the mechanism's internal workings and considerable skill to implement without detection. Miss Marple's quiet investigation. While Inspector Slack pursued his official inquiries, Miss Marple conducted her own gentle investigation through the time-honored method of social calls and casual conversation. Her visit to Mrs. Hartwell, ostensibly to deliver a finished baby garment and a cherry tart, revealed several details that would have escaped less observant eyes. Eleanor Hartwell appeared even paler in daylight, with shadows beneath her eyes that suggested more than ordinary grief over a neighbor's death. The sitting room bore subtle signs of distress, sheet music set askew on the piano, an unopened letter on the mantel addressed in masculine handwriting, and that particular atmosphere of worry that leaves its own residue in confined spaces. "The clock was horrible," Mrs. Hartwell said when Miss Marple gently mentioned the previous day's events. "I've always hated—" She stopped abruptly, biting down on whatever revelation had almost escaped, and attempted a smile that failed to reach her eyes. Miss Marple's sharp gaze took in the small brass key on the writing desk, noting the scratches around its bow and the blackish smear along its shaft that was decidedly not ink. When Eleanor noticed her glance and quickly covered the key with the paper, the gesture told Miss Marple as much as any confession might have done. Growing doubts and alternative theories. During her afternoon walk, Miss Marple examined the orchard gate more closely, running her fingertip along the latch and detecting the distinctive scent of graphite and oil, a combination she remembered from a nephew's childhood habit of dismantling timepieces. On the stone path beyond, she discovered the ghost of a footprint in the dusty film, small, narrow-heeled, with a tiny chip at the inside corner that spoke of delicate shoes and hasty movement. Dr. Hartwell had privately expressed his doubts about James Whitmore's guilt to his wife. "I've known the boy since childhood," he confided. "Hot-tempered, perhaps, but hardly capable of cold-blooded murder. There's something about this whole business that doesn't ring true." His wife's reaction to this observation was telling. a sharp look followed by increased agitation, as though the possibility of James's innocence was more disturbing than the certainty of his guilt. The convenient solution. By evening, Inspector Slack's investigation had reached what appeared to be its natural conclusion. James Whitmore was brought in for formal questioning, and this time he did not emerge from the library. The village buzzed with anticipation of formal charges, most residents expressing satisfaction that the matter was being resolved with such efficiency. Miss Marple, however, found herself increasingly troubled by the case's apparent simplicity. The evidence against James was almost too perfect, too neatly aligned with everyone's expectations. In her considerable experience with human nature, she had learned that real murderers rarely left such obvious trails, particularly when the crime showed signs of careful planning rather than passionate impulse. The walking stick placed so precisely on the pond's coping, the undisturbed gravel around the water's edge, the sophisticated timing of the clock's malfunction, these details suggested a mind that valued control and calculation over the sort of desperate fury that might drive a young man to violence. The shadow of doubt. As night fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations while winding her own reliable timepiece. The community's eagerness to accept James Whitmore as their murderer was understandable but troubling. In her long acquaintance with village life, she had observed that people often preferred comfortable assumptions to uncomfortable truths, especially when those truths might implicate individuals they knew and trusted. The clock that had struck 13 had marked more than the moment of Mr. Fortescue's death. It had been the culmination of a carefully orchestrated plan that relied on misdirection, assumption, and the very human tendency to see what one expected to see rather than what was actually there. Someone had used the confusion of that impossible chime to commit murder, then allowed suspicion to fall naturally on the most obvious candidate. The real killer, Miss Marple suspected, was still moving among them, perhaps even offering condolences to the Whitmore family, hidden in plain sight while an innocent young man faced charges for a crime that required far more sophistication than desperate anger could provide. The 13th chime had been both signal and smokescreen, and until someone recognized it as such, justice would remain as elusive as the truth itself. The morning brought with it the peculiar quality of light that follows dramatic events. Everything appeared sharper, more defined, as though the very air had been clarified by tragedy. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, but her constitutional walk through the village lanes carried a different purpose than usual. Armed with a small basket containing seed cake and the sort of domestic excuse that opened doors throughout St. Mary Mead, she set out to pursue the threads of observation that had been weaving themselves through her mind since the previous afternoon's shocking events. The clock specialist's quarters. Her first destination was the Blue Boar, where Mr. Leonard Thorne had taken lodgings during his restoration work. The inn's parlor smelled faintly of ale and lavender polish, creating an atmosphere of comfortable respectability that made the clock specialist's obvious agitation all the more noticeable. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of a sleepless night, hair standing in unruly points, cufflinks askew, and a general air of barely controlled anxiety that suggested more than professional concern about yesterday's mechanical malfunction. "You are very kind, Miss," he began, accepting her offering of seed cake with hands that trembled slightly. "Marple," she supplied gently, placing the plate on a side table already cluttered with the tools of his trade. Her apparently vague eyes took in every detail: the leather tool roll, a chamois cloth bearing suspicious stains, and, most significantly, a small bottle labeled in neat handwriting as graphite oil compound. Such specialized lubricants were essential for delicate clock work, but they also left distinctive traces on everything they touched. Among his instruments, she noticed slender brass rods bound with twine, one fitted with a screw end designed to accept interchangeable heads. Such tools were invaluable for working in confined spaces, behind clock faces, for instance, or when one needed to manipulate objects from a distance without leaving obvious fingerprints or getting one's clothing wet. Mr. Thorne followed her glance with obvious discomfort, quickly rolling his tools into their leather case. "One should never be without proper instruments, even in the country," he said, his voice carrying forced lightness. "How very true," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I've always found that the country manages quite well without many mechanical flourishes. The 13th chime yesterday, for instance. Such an unusual addition to your restoration work." His mouth tightened perceptibly. "If you refer to that unfortunate malfunction—" "Oh, I thought it rather clever," she interrupted with gentle reassurance. "Only it does rather fix one's attention, doesn't it? People remember exactly where they were standing, who was nearby, who moved during those crucial moments. Physical evidence and observations." As their conversation continued, Miss Marple's trained eye catalogued several telling details. The chamois cloth bore not only the expected residue of metal polish, but also a distinctly greenish smear, the translucent stain that came from lily stems when they were disturbed or broken. When Mr. Thorne noticed her glance, he quickly covered the cloth with her cake plate, as though sheltering it from further observation. More significantly, she observed that his signet ring, a heavy silver affair on his right hand, bore a tiny, almost invisible scratch on its surface. The mark was precise and deliberate, the sort that might be made when using the ring to apply pressure to a hard surface, perhaps to leave a corresponding mark elsewhere. "I was just thinking," Miss Marple continued conversationally, "about poor Mr. Fortescue's walking stick. Such a beautiful piece with that elaborate silver head. I noticed it lying so precisely on the pond's coping, almost as though someone had placed it there deliberately, rather than letting it fall naturally." Mr. Thorne's reaction was swift and telling. His hand moved instinctively to his ring, twisting it nervously, while his eyes darted toward his tool case. "I wouldn't know about that. I was attending to the clock mechanism when the alarm was raised. Ask the vicar, ask Sir Barnaby. They'll confirm I never left my post." The discovery at the pond. Later that morning, Miss Marple returned to the scene of the tragedy under the pretense of retrieving a dropped knitting needle. The police had completed their initial examination, leaving behind only the faint scent of official investigation and the lingering chill of unresolved questions. She moved slowly around the ornamental pond, her sensible shoes making barely a sound on the gravel path. The walking stick's position continued to trouble her. It lay at a precise angle on the stone coping, its silver head gleaming in the morning sunlight. Most observers would see this as evidence of a fall or perhaps careful police preservation of the scene. But Miss Marple remembered that multiple witnesses had noted the stick's position before any official examination began. Leaning closer under the pretense of admiring a particularly fine rose bush, she examined the silver head more carefully. Beneath the ornate engraving, where silver met dark wood, was a minute scratch, not the deep gouge one might expect from impact with stone or gravel, but a precise, almost surgical mark made by something sharp and very hard. Caught in the fine etching of the silver was a dark residue with a peculiar metallic glint. She touched it lightly with her gloved finger, finding it gritty and unlike ordinary garden dirt. When she carefully folded her glove to preserve the sample, she noticed it left exactly the sort of mark she had observed on Mr. Thorne's chamois cloth. Connecting the evidence. The pattern was becoming clearer with each observation. The metallic residue, the precise scratch, the specialized tools, and the suspicious timing all pointed toward someone with both technical expertise and careful planning. The 13th chime had not been a malfunction but a deliberate signal, creating confusion at the crucial moment while establishing the perpetrator's apparent presence elsewhere. During her afternoon rounds, Miss Marple encountered young Tommy Fletcher, the baker's son, who had made his own discovery that morning. Hidden behind the old Pemberton monument in the churchyard was a small leather satchel, water-stained and partially concealed beneath fallen leaves. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were several keys showing signs of recent use, traces of the same specialized lubricant she had seen in Mr. Thorne's quarters, and most damning of all, a detailed diagram of clockwork mechanisms with specific notations about timing modifications. The diagram bore the annotation 4 heures, 13 chimes, maximum confusion, written in pencil and partially erased, as though the author had reconsidered the wisdom of committing such details to paper. The satchel itself bore the monogram LT embossed in gold letters, seemingly clear evidence of Leonard Thorne's involvement. Miss Marple's growing concerns. However, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the investigation's apparent simplicity. The evidence against Leonard Thorne was almost too convenient, too perfectly aligned with what one might plan to implicate a clock specialist in a timing-dependent murder. Her long experience with human nature had taught her that truly clever criminals rarely left such obvious trails, particularly when they possessed the intelligence and skill that this crime clearly required. The real murderer, she suspected, understood not only the mechanics of clockwork, but also the mechanics of human psychology. They had created a scenario where suspicion would naturally fall on the most obvious candidate. First James Whitmore with his financial troubles and hot temper, then Leonard Thorne with his technical expertise and access to the mechanism. The deeper pattern. As afternoon shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the various threads she had gathered. The crime showed signs of meticulous planning. The modified clock mechanism, the precisely timed distraction, the careful positioning of evidence, and the deliberate misdirection of suspicion. Such planning required not only technical skill, but intimate knowledge of the community, its relationships, and its likely reactions. The walking stick's placement, the watch stopped at 13 minutes past 4, the satchel hidden where it would eventually be found. These were not the desperate improvisations of a panicked murderer, but the calculated moves of someone who understood that the best way to hide a crime was to provide investigators with increasingly plausible alternatives to the truth. The clock that had struck 13 had been more than a signal or cover for murder. It had been the centerpiece of an elaborate deception designed to hide the real killer behind layers of misdirection and false evidence. Someone in St. Mary Mead possessed not only the technical knowledge to modify complex mechanisms, but also the psychological sophistication to manipulate an entire community's assumptions and reactions. The true challenge. Miss Marple understood that her real challenge was not simply identifying the person with means and opportunity, but recognizing the mind capable of such elaborate deception. The murderer had counted on everyone accepting the obvious explanations. First, the hot-headed young man, then the suspicious outsider with specialized knowledge. They had created a perfect puzzle where each piece of evidence led inexorably toward a predetermined conclusion, while the truth remained hidden in plain sight. As evening approached and Inspector Slack prepared to make his arrest based on the discovered evidence, Miss Marple knew that the real test was yet to come. The 13th chime had marked not just the moment of murder, but the beginning of a complex game of misdirection that would require all her skills of observation and understanding to unravel. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, the true killer was watching with satisfaction as their carefully laid plans unfolded exactly as intended, confident that their elaborate deception would prove undetectable. The question that remained was whether Miss Marple's gentle but relentless pursuit of truth would prove stronger than the murderer's faith in the power of assumption, in the human tendency to see what they expected rather than what was actually there. The arrest of Leonard Thorne brought a palpable sense of relief to St. Mary Mead, as though a storm cloud had finally passed over the village and allowed normal life to resume. Inspector Slack, satisfied with what appeared to be an airtight case, had moved with characteristic efficiency once the incriminating satchel was discovered. The clock specialist's protests of innocence carried little weight against the mounting physical evidence, and by evening he found himself in custody, facing charges that seemed to fit together with the precision of the very mechanisms he had spent his career perfecting. The village's collective satisfaction. Mrs. Brewster held court in her post office parlor that evening, presiding over the general satisfaction that accompanied the case's apparent resolution. The gathering included most of the village's prominent residents, all eager to discuss the dramatic conclusion to what had threatened to become a prolonged and unsettling mystery. "I always maintained there was something not quite right about that man," declared Colonel Melchett with the authority of hindsight. Too smooth by half, with his elaborate explanations and London mannerisms. Honest craftsmen don't need to make such theatrical displays of their expertise. Dr. Hartwell, who had joined the discussion after completing his evening rounds, appeared less convinced by the neat resolution. "The evidence certainly seems conclusive," he admitted, reluctantly. "But something about the whole affair troubles me. The precision of the timing, the sophistication of the deception. It suggests a mind that thinks several moves ahead, someone with intimate knowledge of how investigations proceed." His wife, Eleanor, who had been sitting quietly in the corner with her embroidery, looked up sharply at this observation. "Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one, Michael," she said with unusual firmness. "Mr. Thorne had the technical knowledge, the opportunity, and clearly some sort of motive we haven't fully understood. What more evidence could we possibly need?" Miss Marple's growing unease. While the rest of St. Mary Mead celebrated the mystery's resolution, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that others seemed eager to dismiss. She had spent the afternoon in quiet contemplation, her knitting needles moving with mechanical precision while her mind worked through the various inconsistencies that continued to nag at her consciousness like persistent thorns. The leather satchel's discovery had been altogether too convenient, too perfectly timed to provide exactly the evidence needed for a swift arrest. In her considerable experience with human nature, genuine criminals rarely left such obvious trails, particularly when they possessed the intelligence and foresight that this crime clearly required. The satchel felt like a theatrical prop, placed precisely where it would be found at the optimal moment to advance a carefully scripted narrative. Most troubling was the matter of the handwriting on the incriminating diagram. Miss Marple had observed the generous loops on the letters, the rounded formation of the words, a script that bore little resemblance to the neat, narrow labeling she had seen in Thorne's tool case. People might alter their behavior under stress, but handwriting, like fingerprints, carried the indelible marks of individual character that were nearly impossible to disguise completely. Technical inconsistencies and physical evidence. During her morning constitutional, Miss Marple had made a point of examining the restored clock mechanism more closely, drawing upon memories of her nephew Raymond's passionate explanations of clockwork principles during his mechanical phase. The modification that produced the 13th chime was indeed sophisticated, but it showed signs of hasty implementation rather than the careful craftsmanship one would expect from a professional restoration. The brass fittings displayed file marks suggesting recent alteration, and the weight distribution created a subtle vibration that no true craftsman would have tolerated. These details pointed to someone working under time pressure, perhaps someone who had acquired the necessary knowledge recently rather than through years of dedicated practice. Near the clock's base, she had discovered a tiny brass shaving that the police examination had overlooked, a delicate curl of metal bearing tool marks that didn't match any instrument in Leonard Thorne's carefully organized kit. This suggested that someone else had been working on the mechanism, possibly after Thorne had completed his official restoration work. Eleanor Hartwell's deteriorating composure, determined to pursue the threads of observation that others had dismissed, Miss Marple paid a second visit to Mrs. Hartwell under the gentle pretense of inquiring after the doctor's demanding schedule. She found Eleanor looking even more strained than before, her usually immaculate appearance showing subtle signs of distress that spoke of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. The house itself seemed to reflect its mistress's troubled state. Usually a picture of genteel order, it now carried an atmosphere of barely controlled tension, as though the very walls were holding their breath. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, and her conversation carried an edge of desperation that hadn't been present during their previous encounter. "It's all been such a terrible shock," Miss Marple began sympathetically, settling into her chair with practiced ease. Poor Mr. Thorne, to find himself accused so suddenly, though I must say that clock mechanism of his was quite remarkable. The extra chime was so unexpected, so precisely timed. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and telling. She flinched as though struck, her teacup rattling against its saucer. "I detest clocks," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Always have. They mock you with their relentless ticking, reminding you constantly of time passing, of moments you can never reclaim or change." Miss Marple's observant eyes noted the way Eleanor's gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the window, as though seeing not the peaceful garden, but some far more troubling landscape of memory. The 13th chime felt like a warning, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining intensity, a signal that time had finally run out for secrets that should have remained buried. The pattern of deliberate misdirection. As the conversation continued, Miss Marple began to perceive the sophisticated pattern of misdirection that had characterized the entire investigation. The murderer had demonstrated remarkable understanding of human psychology, creating a scenario where suspicion would fall naturally on the most obvious candidates while the real perpetrator remained safely hidden among the shocked and grieving community. The timing of each revelation had been masterfully orchestrated. First, James Whitmore's financial troubles and public confrontation with the victim had made him the natural suspect. Then, just as doubts about his guilt began to emerge, Leonard Thorne's nervousness and technical expertise had provided an alternative explanation that satisfied both logic and prejudice against outsiders. Finally, the convenient discovery of the planted satchel had sealed the case with apparently irrefutable physical evidence. Such orchestration required not only technical knowledge of clockwork mechanisms, but intimate familiarity with the community's dynamics, relationships, and predictable reactions. The killer had counted on everyone's natural desire for a satisfying resolution rather than an uncomfortable confrontation with more complex truths. Physical evidence and personal knowledge. Miss Marple's systematic review of the accumulated evidence revealed connections that others had overlooked or dismissed as coincidental. Eleanor Hartwell's unusual agitation whenever timepieces were mentioned, her quick concealment of the brass key with its telltale scratches, and her strangely vehement insistence on Leonard Thorne's guilt all suggested knowledge she was desperately trying to conceal. The doctor's wife had been present at every crucial moment, near the clock during its ominous malfunction, close to the ornamental pond when the body was discovered, and conspicuously eager to accept each successive explanation for the crime. Her delicate shoes would have made the narrow-heeled footprint Miss Marple had discovered in the orchard, complete with its distinctive chip that spoke of expensive footwear worn by someone unaccustomed to rough ground. Most significantly, Eleanor Hartwell possessed both the technical knowledge and psychological sophistication that the crime demanded. Her late father had been a respected clockmaker in a neighboring town, and she had grown up surrounded by the intricate mechanisms that govern the measurement of time itself. Her musical training had developed an acute sense of rhythm and timing, while her position as the doctor's wife provided intimate knowledge of the community's secrets, relationships, and vulnerabilities. The motive crystallizes. As the various threads began to weave themselves into a coherent pattern, the motive for Mr. Fortescue's murder became increasingly clear. His wartime profiteering had involved more than simple overcharging for patriotic contracts. His business had supplied substandard medical equipment to military hospitals, equipment that had failed at crucial moments and cost precious lives. The unopened letter on Eleanor's mantel, addressed in masculine handwriting, was likely correspondence from a military hospital or veterans organization, perhaps containing long-delayed information about equipment failures that had occurred during the war's darkest hours. Mr. Fortescue's recent move to St. Mary Mead had brought him within reach of someone who had been waiting years for the opportunity to exact justice for crimes that the official legal system would never address. The approaching confrontation. As evening shadows lengthened across the village, Miss Marple understood that the time for gentle observation and indirect inquiry was drawing to a close. Leonard Thorne sat in custody, facing charges for a crime he had not committed, while the real murderer moved freely among neighbors who trusted and respected her position in the community. The clock that had struck 13 had been more than a mechanical marvel or a convenient distraction. It had been the culmination of a carefully planned campaign of vengeance that had finally found its moment of fulfillment. Someone had used their knowledge of both human nature and mechanical precision to create what appeared to be the perfect crime, counting on the community's desire for simple answers and the investigators' focus on obvious evidence. However, they had underestimated the persistence of quiet observation and the power of seemingly insignificant details to illuminate larger truths. The brass key with its distinctive scratches, the specialized knowledge of clockwork required for the modification, the psychological sophistication of the entire deception, all pointed toward someone who combined technical skill with intimate understanding of human nature and a burning desire for justice that had transformed into something far more dangerous. The 13th chime had marked not just the moment of murder, but the beginning of a complex game of deception that would require all of Miss Marple's accumulated wisdom to unravel. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would either expose the truth or allow injustice to triumph through the very human tendency to accept comfortable explanations rather than pursue uncomfortable realities. The real test of her abilities was yet to come, and she knew that time, that most precious and unforgiving of commodities, was running short for everyone involved in this deadly masquerade. The morning after Leonard Thorne's arrest brought with it the peculiar quality of relief that settles over a community when a satisfactory explanation has been provided for disturbing events. St. Mary Mead seemed to exhale collectively, as though it had been holding its breath since the discovery of Mr. Fortescue's body. Conversations at the post office and over garden gates carried a lighter tone, and even the weather appeared to cooperate, offering the sort of gentle sunshine that suggested normalcy had been restored to their corner of England. The village's false security, Mrs. Brewster presided over the general satisfaction from her strategic position behind the post office counter, dispensing both stamps and commentary with equal efficiency. The physical evidence against Leonard Thorne had been compelling enough to satisfy even the most skeptical villagers, and Inspector Slack's confident manner suggested that the case would soon be closed with the sort of administrative finality that proper English justice demanded. "Such a relief to have it settled," declared Colonel Melchett during his morning visit to collect his pension. "Though I must say, the fellow put up quite a convincing show of innocence. These London types are often accomplished actors when their necks are on the line." Dr. Hartwell, making his rounds with the methodical precision that characterized all his professional activities, appeared less convinced by the tidy resolution. His medical training had taught him to look beyond obvious symptoms to underlying causes, and something about the entire affair continued to trouble his analytical mind. When questioned by concerned patients about the village's recent excitement, he offered only non-committal responses that suggested professional discretion rather than genuine certainty about the case's conclusion. Miss Marple's persistent observations. While others celebrated the mystery's apparent solution, Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by details that seemed to contradict the official narrative. Her morning constitutional took her past the church, where she paused to examine the restored clock with the sort of attention usually reserved for particularly complex knitting patterns. The mechanism showed signs of recent tampering that went beyond Mr. Thorne's original restoration work. Fresh scratches on the brass fittings, slight misalignments in the gear assembly, and most tellingly, traces of a specialized lubricant that differed from the standard oils found in the clock specialist's kit. The discovery of tiny brass filings near the base of the mechanism provided additional evidence of unauthorized modification. These delicate shavings bore tool marks that didn't match any instrument in Leonard Thorne's carefully organized collection, suggesting that someone else had been working on the clock with equipment designed for different purposes entirely. The metallic composition of the filings reminded Miss Marple of her nephew Raymond's descriptions of surgical instruments, brass alloys chosen for their resistance to corrosion and their ability to maintain sharp edges under repeated sterilization. Eleanor Hartwell's deteriorating composure, Miss Marple's afternoon visit to the Hartwell cottage, ostensibly to deliver a completed christening gown and inquire after the doctor's health, revealed subtle but significant changes in Eleanor's demeanor. The usually immaculate sitting room showed signs of distracted maintenance, flowers left too long in their vases, newspapers folded incorrectly, and that particular atmosphere of barely controlled tension that accompanies guilty knowledge. Eleanor herself appeared increasingly fragile, her carefully maintained composure showing hairline cracks that suggested considerable internal pressure. Her hands moved restlessly throughout their conversation, alternately smoothing her skirt, adjusting her hair, and fidgeting with small objects in ways that spoke of profound, nervous agitation. Most significantly, the brass key that had been so prominently displayed on her writing desk had disappeared, replaced by a faint outline in the dust that marked its former position. "Such a terrible business," Eleanor murmured when Miss Marple gently mentioned the recent events, "though I suppose we must be grateful that justice has been served so quickly. Mr. Thorne seemed like such a respectable gentleman, but one can never truly know what darkness lies beneath a polished exterior." Her words carried a brittle quality that suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as her visitor. When Miss Marple observed that the clock's 13th chime had been remarkably well timed to create maximum confusion, Eleanor's reaction was immediate and telling, a sharp intake of breath followed by a too quick agreement that such coincidences were indeed remarkable. The weight of technical evidence. During her careful examination of the crime scene, Miss Marple had discovered additional physical evidence that the official investigation had either overlooked or dismissed as irrelevant. The walking stick's silver head bore microscopic scratches that formed a distinctive pattern. Not the random marks one might expect from accidental contact with stone or gravel, but precise lines that suggested deliberate scoring by a sharp instrument. More significantly, she had found traces of the same specialized lubricant on the ornamental pond's carefully designed water feature. The mechanism that controlled the fountain's flow showed signs of recent adjustment, with fresh tool marks on components that should have required no maintenance. Someone with considerable technical knowledge had modified the fountain's operation, creating the precise conditions necessary for the murder, while ensuring that all evidence would be washed away by the flowing water. The timing of these modifications corresponded exactly with the period when Eleanor Hartwell had borrowed the church keys from the vicar's wife, ostensibly for ladies' guild activities that had been extended due to influenza. Such access would have provided ample opportunity for someone familiar with mechanical principles to study the clock's operation and plan the sophisticated modifications that had produced the ominous 13th chime. Psychological pressure and revealing reactions. Miss Marple's gentle but persistent questioning began to reveal the psychological strain that Eleanor was experiencing beneath her carefully maintained facade. References to clockwork mechanisms produced visible distress, while mentions of wartime medical equipment caused her to pale noticeably and change the subject with obvious discomfort. The unopened letter on Eleanor's mantelpiece had finally disappeared, though the faint scent of burned paper in the sitting room suggested hasty destruction rather than careful filing. When Miss Marple casually mentioned that correspondence from military hospitals often contained valuable historical information, Eleanor's response was sharp and defensive, quite unlike her usual gentle manner. "Some things are better left in the past," Eleanor said with uncharacteristic firmness. "The war took so much from so many families. Dwelling on old sorrows serves no useful purpose." Yet her eyes told a different story, carrying the haunted quality of someone who had been dwelling on old sorrows for years, nurturing them until they had grown into something far more dangerous than mere grief. The pattern of calculated deception. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple began to perceive the full sophistication of the deception that had been practiced upon the entire community. The murderer had demonstrated not only technical expertise in modifying complex mechanisms, but also psychological insight into human nature that bordered on genius. Every element of the crime had been designed to guide suspicion away from the real perpetrator and toward increasingly plausible alternatives. The timing of Leonard Thorne's arrival in the village, his obvious nervousness about the clock's performance, and his status as an outsider had made him the perfect scapegoat for a crime that required exactly his sort of specialized knowledge. The planted evidence, the forged documentation, and the careful manipulation of physical clues had created a case that appeared airtight while actually concealing a far more complex truth. Building toward confrontation. By evening, Miss Marple understood that the time for indirect observation and gentle questioning was drawing to a close. Leonard Thorne remained in custody, facing charges for a crime he had not committed, while the real murderer moved freely among neighbors who trusted and respected her position in the community. The elaborate deception that had protected Eleanor Hartwell was beginning to unravel under the pressure of Miss Marple's methodical investigation, but it would require direct confrontation to force the complete truth into the open. The brass key with its telltale scratches, the specialized knowledge of both clockwork and human psychology, the carefully timed modifications to church and fountain mechanisms, all pointed towards someone who combined technical skill with burning motivation for revenge. Eleanor's father's background in clockmaking, her own musical training in rhythm and timing, and her obvious distress at any mention of wartime medical equipment suggested a motive rooted in personal tragedy that had finally found its opportunity for expression. The approaching resolution. As night fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of deception that had been woven around the community's desire for simple answers to complicated questions. The clock that had struck 13 had indeed marked more than a mechanical malfunction. It had announced the culmination of a carefully planned campaign of justice that had transformed into something far more dangerous. The real challenge that remained was not simply exposing Eleanor Hartwell's guilt, but doing so in a way that would force the community to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of justice and the price of revenge. The murderer had counted on everyone's natural tendency to accept convenient explanations rather than pursue difficult realities, but Miss Marple's gentle persistence had begun to strip away the comfortable illusions that protected both the guilty and the innocent from the full complexity of human motivation. Tomorrow would bring the confrontation that would either expose the truth or allow injustice to triumph through the very human tendency to see what one expected rather than what was actually there. The 13th chime had been both signal and smokescreen, marking not just the moment of murder, but the beginning of a moral reckoning that would test everyone's capacity to distinguish between justice and vengeance, between truth and comfortable assumption. The stage was set for a final act that would require all of Miss Marple's accumulated wisdom about human nature to navigate successfully, knowing that the price of failure would be measured not just in Leonard Thorne's continued imprisonment, but in the community's willingness to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the most dangerous criminals are those who believe most fervently in the righteousness of their cause. The morning brought disturbing news that would reshape the entire investigation. A telegram from London arrived at Sir Barnaby's manor, its official seal and crisp paper lending gravity to Inspector Slack's already troubled expression. The message, brief but devastating in its implications, revealed that Mr. Fortescue had been scheduled to meet with solicitors the following week regarding allegations raised by a veterans association Complaints about defective medical supplies sold under wartime contracts, incidents directly linked to preventable fatalities in military hospitals. The village reacts to new revelations. Word of the telegram's contents spread through St. Mary Mead with the efficiency of a well-oiled communication network, transforming the community's understanding of their recent tragedy. Mrs. Brewster, presiding over discussions in her post office parlor, nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. "War profiteering," she declared to her assembled audience. "I always said there was something unsavory about that man's fortune. Blood money, if you ask me." Dr. Hartwell, receiving the news during his afternoon rounds, felt the uncomfortable confirmation of suspicions he had harbored but never voiced. The revelation cast Mr. Fortescue's death in an entirely different light. No longer the murder of an unpopular but essentially harmless businessman, but the elimination of someone whose wartime activities had caused genuine suffering and loss of life. Eleanor Hartwell's reaction to the news was notably subdued, her face maintaining the composed expression of someone receiving information she had long possessed. When neighbors offered their shocked commentary about the revelations, she responded with carefully neutral observations that struck Miss Marple as remarkably well rehearsed for spontaneous reactions. Miss Marple's systematic analysis. The new information prompted Miss Marple to request a private meeting with Inspector Slack, whose confidence in Leonard Thorne's guilt needed to be carefully undermined before any progress toward truth could be achieved. She found him in Sir Barnaby's library, surrounded by case files and evidence bags, preparing what he clearly expected to be the final documentation of a solved crime. "Inspector," Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness, "I wonder if you might indulge an old woman's curiosity about some technical details that have been troubling me." She proceeded to lay out her observations with methodical precision. The brass filings near the clock mechanism that didn't match any tool in Thorne's kit suggested someone else had been working on the device. The handwriting on the planted diagram showed characteristics, generous loops and rounded formations, that differed significantly from the neat, narrow script visible on Thorne's legitimate documentation. Most significantly, the timing of the 13th chime required not just mechanical expertise but intimate knowledge of community routines, individual habits, and social dynamics that no outsider could possibly possess. The murderer needed to know exactly where everyone would be standing, how they would react, and most importantly, how the investigation would likely proceed, Miss Marple explained patiently. Physical evidence reconsidered. Inspector Slack's initial resistance began to waver as Miss Marple demonstrated the sophisticated planning that had gone into every aspect of the crime. The fountain mechanism's modification, which had created precisely the right water conditions for drowning while ensuring evidence would be naturally washed away, required detailed knowledge of the manor's mechanical systems and maintenance schedules. The walking stick's placement on the pond's coping showed signs of deliberate positioning rather than accidental dropping. Microscopic examination revealed tool marks on the silver head that didn't correspond to impact with stone or gravel, but rather suggested scoring by a sharp instrument, possibly to create the impression of a struggle that had never actually occurred. The entire scene was staged, Miss Marple concluded quietly. Not hastily, in a moment of passion, but carefully orchestrated by someone who understood both the mechanics of murder and the psychology of investigation. Eleanor's deteriorating composure. As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple turned her attention to Eleanor Hartwell, whose behavior had become increasingly erratic since Leonard Thorne's arrest. Her visit to the doctor's cottage, ostensibly to deliver a completed baby garment, revealed a household under considerable strain despite the apparent resolution of the village's troubles. Eleanor appeared even more fragile in daylight, her usually immaculate appearance showing subtle signs of neglect that spoke of sleepless nights and constant anxiety. The sitting room, normally a model of domestic order, carried an atmosphere of barely controlled tension that suggested someone struggling to maintain normal routines while harboring devastating secrets. "Such a relief that the mystery has been solved," Miss Marple observed conversationally, settling into her usual chair. "Though I confess, I find myself still puzzling over that remarkable 13th chime. Such precise timing, such theatrical effect. Almost as though someone wanted to create a very specific moment of confusion." Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, and her response carried a brittle quality that suggested careful rehearsal. "Mr. Thorne explained about the mechanical malfunction, didn't he? These old mechanisms can be quite unpredictable when they're disturbed." The weight of technical knowledge. Miss Marple's gentle questioning began to reveal the depth of Eleanor's technical understanding, knowledge that extended far beyond what any ordinary village housewife might possess. Reference to clockwork principles, mechanical timing, and precision instruments elicited responses that demonstrated familiarity with concepts that could only have come from extensive study or family background. "Your father was quite renowned for his clock-making skills," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Such intricate work requires not only technical expertise, but an almost musical sense of timing and rhythm. I imagine growing up in such an environment would give one considerable appreciation for mechanical precision." Eleanor's reaction was immediate and telling, a sharp intake of breath followed by a too quick denial of any particular mechanical aptitude. Yet her eyes betrayed knowledge she was desperately trying to conceal, the sort of intimate understanding that came from years of exposure to the principles governing the measurement and manipulation of time itself. Building psychological pressure. As their conversation continued, Miss Marple began to apply the sort of gentle but relentless pressure that had served her so well in previous investigations. She spoke of the war years, of the sacrifices made by medical personnel, of the particular tragedy that befell families whose loved ones died not from enemy action, but from preventable failures of equipment and supply. Such losses must have been especially difficult for medical families, she observed with apparent sympathy. To know that proper equipment might have saved lives, that someone's greed or carelessness had cost precious time when seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Eleanor's composure began to crack under this sustained attention to precisely the subjects she most desperately wanted to avoid. Her responses became increasingly agitated, her carefully maintained facade showing hairline fractures that suggested the enormous pressure she was under to maintain her deception while watching an innocent man face charges for her crime. The approaching crisis. By evening, Miss Marple understood that the psychological pressure she had been applying was approaching its breaking point. Eleanor's behavior showed all the signs of someone whose carefully constructed defenses were beginning to crumble under the weight of guilt, fear, and the constant effort required to maintain an elaborate lie. The brass key had reappeared on Eleanor's writing desk, polished to a suspicious shine that suggested desperate attempts to remove incriminating evidence. Her hands showed faint stains that spoke of recent work with metal polish and abrasive compounds, the sort of frantic cleaning that accompanied the realization that physical evidence might betray carefully hidden secrets. Most tellingly, Eleanor's reference to Leonard Thorne had become increasingly vehement, as though she were trying to convince herself as much as others of his guilt. The psychological mechanism of projection was becoming clearly visible. The more doubt she felt about allowing an innocent man to suffer for her crime, the more forcefully she insisted on his culpability. The stage set for resolution. As night fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on the delicate balance she had achieved. The evidence against Leonard Thorne had been systematically undermined. Eleanor's psychological defenses had been carefully eroded, and the stage was set for the sort of final confrontation that would force the complete truth into the open. The clock that had struck 13 had indeed marked more than a mechanical malfunction. It had announced the culmination of years of carefully suppressed grief and anger that had finally found expression in an act of calculated vengeance. The challenge now would be guiding Eleanor toward confession, while ensuring that justice would be served for both the guilty and the innocent. Tomorrow would bring the final reckoning, the moment when all the careful observations, accumulated evidence, and psychological insights would combine to reveal the complete truth about Mr. Fortescue's death. The 13th chime had been both signal and symbol, marking not just the moment of murder, but the intersection of technical skill and human psychology, of understandable grief and inexcusable deception. Miss Marple understood that her role in the approaching confrontation would require all her accumulated wisdom about human nature, her ability to balance justice with compassion, and her skill at revealing truth while preserving what dignity remained for those whose lives had been shattered by the complex interplay of past tragedy and present vengeance. The real test of her abilities was yet to come, and she knew that the resolution would satisfy neither simple justice nor easy forgiveness, but something far more complex and ultimately more human than either. The morning brought with it a peculiar quality of anticipation that seemed to hover over St. Mary Mead like morning mist refusing to lift. Miss Marple had spent the early hours in careful preparation, arranging what appeared to be a simple social call but was, in reality, the final movement in a complex symphony of observation and deduction that had been building since the clock first struck 13. The gentle trap. Her destination was the Hartwell cottage, where she arrived bearing a basket of early roses and the sort of domestic excuse that opened doors throughout the village. Eleanor received her with the strained courtesy of someone operating at the very limits of self-control, her usually immaculate appearance showing subtle signs of the enormous pressure she had been under since Leonard Thorne's arrest. The sitting room carried an atmosphere of barely contained tension, with wilted flowers providing mute testimony to Eleanor's distracted state of mind. Most tellingly, the brass key had reappeared on the writing desk, polished to an almost suspicious shine that suggested desperate attempts to remove incriminating evidence. "I've been thinking about that remarkable clock mechanism," Miss Marple began conversationally, settling into her usual chair with practiced ease. "Such sophisticated work, requiring not just technical knowledge but an almost musical sense of timing. Your father's training in clock-making must have provided considerable insight into such delicate mechanisms." Eleanor's reaction was immediate and telling, a sharp intake of breath followed by hands that moved restlessly in her lap, betraying the nervous energy she was struggling to contain. "I know very little about such things, Miss Marple. Father's work was quite beyond my understanding. The weight of evidence." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes took in every detail of Eleanor's deteriorating composure as she continued her gentle but relentless questioning. From her knitting bag, she produced a small folded paper containing brass filings, delicate shavings that bore tool marks inconsistent with any instrument in Leonard Thorne's professional kit, but remarkably similar to the surgical precision tools commonly found in medical households. "These were discovered near the clock mechanism," she explained with deceptive mildness. "The tool marks suggest instruments designed for very delicate work, the sort of precision required for both clockwork and medical procedures. The specialized lubricant used in the modification was also quite distinctive, not the standard oil employed by professional clockmakers, but a medical-grade compound designed for instruments that require both durability and sterility." Eleanor's face had gone pale, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid as Miss Marple's methodical presentation continued. The fingerprint evidence from the church gate, the handwriting analysis of the planted diagram, the sophisticated timing of the fountain's modification. Each piece of evidence built upon the last, creating an increasingly inescapable web of physical proof. The psychological pressure. The 13th chime was particularly clever, Miss Marple observed, her needles clicking with rhythmic precision. Not a malfunction at all, but a carefully programmed signal, timed to create maximum confusion at precisely the moment when Mr. Fortescue would be lured to the ornamental pond. Someone with intimate knowledge of both the manor's mechanical systems and the community's social dynamics had orchestrated every detail. Eleanor's carefully maintained facade was beginning to crack under the sustained pressure, her eyes darting around the room as though seeking escape from truths that could no longer be avoided. When Miss Marple mentioned the wartime correspondence about defective medical equipment, Eleanor's composure finally shattered completely. "He killed them," she whispered, the words barely audible in the suddenly silent room. All those brave men, dying not from enemy action, but from equipment failures that could have been prevented if Reginald Fortescue hadn't been so concerned with profit margins. The confession emerges. The story that poured out was one of grief transformed into obsession, of years spent nurturing anger until it had grown into something far more dangerous than simple sorrow. Eleanor's brother David had been a young medical orderly at a field hospital, killed not by enemy fire, but by the failure of a cardiac monitor that had been manufactured to substandard specifications by one of Fortescue's wartime contracts. "I was there," Eleanor continued, her voice breaking with remembered anguish. "Working as a volunteer nurse, watching David try desperately to save a wounded soldier while that machine, that worthless piece of equipment, failed at the crucial moment. Both men died because Reginald Fortescue valued profit over human life." The elaborate planning that had gone into Mr. Fortescue's murder emerged with painful clarity. Eleanor's father's clock-making tools had provided the means to modify the church mechanism, while her position as the doctor's wife had given her access to both the manor's water systems and detailed knowledge of community routines and relationships. The method revealed. The fountain's modification was the most complex part, Eleanor explained with the detached precision of someone describing a medical procedure. "I used my knowledge of the manor's mechanical systems, gained through Michael's practice visits, to adjust the water flow. The timing had to be perfect, enough turbulence to suggest accident, sufficient depth for drowning, but not so obvious as to appear deliberately dangerous. The walking stick's careful positioning, the watch stopped at 13 minutes past 4, the planted evidence against Leonard Thorne. Each element had been designed to guide the investigation away from the real perpetrator and toward increasingly plausible alternatives. The 13th chime had been both signal and smokescreen, creating the confusion necessary for murder while establishing Eleanor's apparent presence elsewhere. The moral complexity. As Eleanor's confession concluded, Miss Marple reflected on the complex interplay of justice and vengeance that had driven the crime. Mr. Fortescue's wartime activities had indeed cost lives, and Eleanor's grief was both genuine and justified, even if her response had crossed the line from seeking justice into exacting revenge. "I understand the pain that drove you to this," Miss Marple said gently, her voice carrying genuine compassion despite the gravity of Eleanor's crimes. "The loss of someone precious, the frustration of seeing injustice go unpunished. These are feelings that can consume a person if they're not properly addressed. But murder, however justified it might seem, creates new injustices that spread far beyond the original grievance." Inspector Slack's arrival, summoned by Miss Marple's earlier message, brought the confrontation to its inevitable conclusion. Eleanor offered no resistance, her confession having lifted the enormous weight she had been carrying while simultaneously sealing her fate. Dr. Hartwell, arriving to find his wife under arrest, stood in stunned silence as he struggled to reconcile the woman he had married with the calculating killer she had revealed herself to be. The price of vengeance. As the grey morning gave way to an equally somber afternoon, Miss Marple understood that the resolution of Mr. Fortescue's murder would satisfy no one completely. Justice had been served, but at enormous cost to everyone involved. Eleanor would face trial for her crimes. Leonard Thorne would be released, but with his reputation forever tainted, and the community would grapple with uncomfortable questions about the nature of justice and the price of revenge. The clock that had struck 13 had indeed announced more than a mechanical malfunction. It had marked the moment when years of suppressed grief and anger had finally found expression in an act that satisfied neither justice nor healing, but something far more complex and ultimately more destructive than either. In seeking to balance the scales of wartime injustice, Eleanor had created new imbalances that would ripple through many lives for years to come. The aftermath. As Inspector Slack completed the necessary formalities and Eleanor was led away with quiet dignity, Miss Marple gathered her, knitting with characteristic precision. The truth had been revealed through patient observation and gentle persistence, but the victory felt hollow in the face of such human tragedy. The 13th chime had been both beginning and ending, marking not just the moment of murder, but the culmination of a grief that had been allowed to fester until it transformed into something poisonous. The real tragedy lay not simply in Mr. Fortescue's death or Eleanor's crime, but in the recognition that proper justice, administered years earlier, might have prevented both the original suffering and its terrible consequences. In her neat cottage that evening, Miss Marple wound her reliable timepiece and reflected on the delicate mechanisms that governed both clockwork and human nature. Both required careful regulation to prevent the sort of catastrophic failures that destroyed far more than they ever repaired. The lesson of the 13th chime would linger long after the legal proceedings concluded, a reminder that time, once lost, could never be recovered, and that vengeance, however satisfying it might seem, ultimately created more wounds than it could ever heal. The village of St. Mary Mead possessed that peculiar English resilience that transforms tragedy into memory without diminishing its lessons. In the weeks following Eleanor Hartwell's confession, the community adjusted itself with the careful precision of a clockmaker resetting a delicate mechanism, making space for sorrow while ensuring that the ordinary business of living continued its measured pace. The aftermath of truth. Leonard Thorne departed St. Mary Mead with a dignity that spoke more eloquently than any formal vindication could have done. Sir Barnaby had insisted he remain at the manor long enough to complete the clock's restoration, an offer the specialist accepted with quiet grace. His final act was to dismantle the mechanism that had produced the 13th chime, restoring the timepiece to its proper, humble function of marking hours rather than creating dramatic effects. "Some flourishes," he observed to the vicar as he packed his tools with methodical care, "do not belong in honest work." His departure was witnessed by several villagers who had gathered, perhaps unconsciously, to offer the sort of awkward apologies that the English excel at providing. Mrs. Brewster pressed a jar of her finest marmalade into his hands, while Colonel Melchett cleared his throat several times before managing a gruff acknowledgement that mistakes had been made by all concerned. The clock specialist's final gesture was a letter to Sir Barnaby, declining any payment beyond his original fee and expressing the hope that the restored timepiece would serve the community faithfully for generations to come. "Time," he wrote in his neat hand, "should be a comfort, not a torment." Individual reckonings. Dr. Michael Hartwell faced perhaps the most difficult adjustment of anyone in the community. His professional life, built upon the foundation of trust between physician and patient, had been shattered by the revelation that his most intimate relationship had been based on deception. The young doctor continued his rounds with stoic determination, but his face bore the indelible marks of someone who had been forced to question everything he thought he knew about human nature. Within a month, he announced his intention to sell his practice and seek a position in a London hospital, where the anonymity of urban medicine might provide refuge from the weight of village memory. His departure was marked by genuine regret from patients who had come to appreciate his skill and dedication, even as they struggled to reconcile the competent physician with the man who had been so thoroughly deceived by his own wife. James Whitmore, meanwhile, had emerged from the crisis with a maturity that surprised even his parents. His arrangement to repay the embezzled funds through a combination of salary reduction and weekend employment demonstrated a commitment to responsibility that boded well for his future. When he encountered Miss Marple outside the greengrocer's, he stopped to express his gratitude with the awkward sincerity of youth learning hard lessons about integrity. "Father will keep his position," he reported with obvious relief. "I've learned that some mistakes can be corrected, provided one is willing to do the work required." Miss Marple's gentle smile suggested that such lessons, however painful in the learning, were among life's most valuable acquisitions. The community's moral struggle, the revelation of Mr. Fortescue's wartime profiteering, had complicated the village's response to his murder in ways that challenged their fundamental assumptions about justice and morality. Mrs. Brewster, presiding over discussions in her post office parlor, found her usual certainties shaken by the case's moral ambiguities. "Not that murder is ever justified," she declared to her assembled audience, though her voice carried less conviction than usual. "But one can understand how a person might be driven to such desperate measures by grievous wrongs. Those poor boys in the hospitals, dying because someone valued profit over proper equipment." The Ladies' Guild meetings took on a subdued tone as members wrestled with their conflicted feelings about Eleanor's crime. Many had lost loved ones during the war, and the knowledge that some deaths had been preventable created a bitter undercurrent to their charitable discussions. The comfortable certainties of village life had been disrupted by the recognition that justice and law were not always synonymous. Inspector Slack's investigation had uncovered evidence of systematic fraud in Fortescue's wartime contracts, leading to a broader inquiry that would eventually result in parliamentary questions and official reviews. Veterans organizations seized upon the revelations as validation of complaints they had been making for years about substandard equipment and inadequate medical supplies. Miss Marple's reflections. In the quiet of her cottage garden, Miss Marple tended her roses while reflecting on the complex lessons the case had provided. Her knitting needles clicked with rhythmic precision as she worked on a new christening shawl, each stitch requiring the same careful attention to detail that had served her so well in unraveling Eleanor's elaborate deception. "It's rather like gardening," she mused to Mrs. Bantry during one of their afternoon conversations. "If one allows grief to grow unchecked, it can choke out all the gentler emotions until nothing remains but the desire for revenge." Eleanor's sorrow was genuine and justified, but she allowed it to become something poisonous that ultimately destroyed far more than it could ever repair. The case had reminded her once again that the most dangerous criminals were often those whose motives were most sympathetic, whose grievances were most justified, and whose methods were most sophisticated. Eleanor Hartwell had possessed all the qualities that made for effective deception: intelligence, social position, technical knowledge, and most dangerously, the absolute conviction that her cause was righteous. The price of vengeance. Eleanor's trial proceeded with the measured dignity of English justice, though the community's response remained deeply conflicted. The judge's sentencing remarks acknowledged the understandable nature of her grief, while condemning the inexcusable methods she had chosen to address it. Her confession had spared the court the need for a lengthy trial, but it had also forced everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between justice and revenge. Dr. Hartwell visited his wife once before her sentencing, returning home with the hollow-eyed expression of someone who had finally understood the full extent of the deception that had governed his married life. Eleanor's careful questions about his patients, her interest in medical equipment and procedures, her knowledge of the community's routines and relationships, all had been gathered in service of her elaborate plan for revenge. The cottage that had once been a symbol of domestic tranquility stood empty after the doctor's departure, its windows dark and garden untended. Eventually, it would be sold to a young family from London, but for months it remained a visible reminder of how thoroughly lives could be shattered when grief was allowed to fester into something more dangerous. The restored order. The clock in St. Petrock's bell tower resumed its humble governance of village life, striking the hours with reliable restraint that seemed almost apologetic after its dramatic malfunction. Those who had witnessed the 13th chime sometimes found themselves counting the strokes at noon, waiting for an extra note that never came. The silence after 12 had become, in its way, more eloquent than any mechanical flourish. Children who had been delighted by the scandal of a clock with improper manners were disappointed by its return to respectability, though their mothers hushed them with more tenderness than they might have shown a fortnight earlier. The community had learned that some irregularities were more dangerous than amusing. Sir Barnaby established a fund to assist veterans in obtaining proper medical equipment at the cottage hospital, the subscription list filling itself with the quiet efficiency of a guilty conscience seeking constructive occupation. The gesture could not undo past wrongs, but it provided a way for the community to channel their complicated feelings into something beneficial. The enduring mystery. As autumn settled over St. Mary Mead, the immediate trauma of the case began to fade into the sort of village legend that would be discussed for generations. The mechanical details would be forgotten, but the moral questions would linger. How does a community balance sympathy for understandable grief against condemnation of inexcusable methods? When does the pursuit of justice become a quest for vengeance? Miss Marple understood that some mysteries could be solved, while others could only be acknowledged. The 13th chime had marked not just the moment of murder, but the recognition that human nature contained complexities that defied simple categorization into innocent and guilty, victim and perpetrator. Final wisdom. On an evening when the restored clock had just chimed 9 with proper restraint, Miss Marple wound her own reliable timepiece and reflected on the delicate mechanisms that governed both clockwork and human behavior. Both required careful regulation to prevent the sort of catastrophic failures that destroyed far more than they could ever repair. The lesson of the 13th chime would endure long after the immediate participants had moved on. A reminder that time, once lost, could never be recovered, and that vengeance, however satisfying it might seem, ultimately created more wounds than it could ever heal. Eleanor Hartwell had succeeded in exposing Mr. Fortescue's crimes, but at a cost that far exceeded any possible benefit. In her neat bedroom, Miss Marple set her watch on the bedside table and turned down the lamp. The village slept peacefully around her, its residents gradually learning to live with the uncomfortable knowledge that evil could wear familiar faces, and that the most understandable crimes were sometimes the most unforgivable. The clock that had struck 13 had taught them all that human nature, like any delicate mechanism, required constant attention and gentle regulation. Left unattended, the smallest irregularity could grow into something that disrupted the entire system. The art, Miss Marple reflected, was not to eliminate such irregularities entirely. That was impossible, but to recognize them early and address them with the sort of patient understanding that prevented small problems from becoming tragic solutions. Outside her window, the clock in St. Petrock's tower marked the passing hours with humble precision, having learned, like the community it served, that some flourishes were too dangerous to repeat. Time moved forward, as it always did, carrying with it the lessons of the past and the hope that wisdom, however painfully acquired, might prevent future tragedies from striking their own impossible chimes.